Hello and welcome to another episode of Gladiators, the show where we discuss and debate literature in all of its forms. If it's written work, it's game. Let's meet the panel.
Hi, I'm Larry.
David.
And I'm Josh. And David Bordelon, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Welcome back to our 8th season.
Thanks a lot.
And today we're going to be going over an modern American literature staple, Nobel Prize Literature winner in Saul Bellow, and we are going to be discussing Herzog, which this is the Library of America edition, so it's bound up. But the most familiar cover is the Penguin Classics edition with the crumpled piece of paper and the foreword by Philip Roth. So I have the discussion starter for Herzog, and it is: do you feel that Moses Herzog is a character that garners sympathy, or do you feel that his perspective is misleading?
At first, I was not sympathetic to him, but by the end of the story, I was. So, I feel that I sympathize with him, so I feel that he was sympathetic.
I think there's moments where you can sympathize with him, but then you see the different angles, and you can. I get sometimes these ideas that he's a bit pretentious, and then later on realize that he's a bit of an idiot with going to get in order to obtain the adoption. If you're a sane. If you feel that you are the sane person to have custody of your daughter, you wouldn't be getting a gun from your adoptive mother's house and bringing it along with you when you take your daughter out to your daughter to the aquarium.
Right.
Clearly.
But he does say right off the bat, very first line, if I'm out of my mind, it's all right with me. Mm-hmm. So he's right off the bat, he's letting us know he is not, stable. He is not in a good place right now.
Yeah.
And so, now it's funny that you said, like he's a likable character. I guess to me, my question, it was almost a question to the question, why does Saul Bellow make him in some ways an unattractive character? Or we can, what's attractive about him? Supposedly he's good looking. He seems to be in touch with his emotions. He's very intelligent, right? Mm-hmm. So I think those are his positives.
College instructor.
Yeah, he seems like a nice guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
The classic nice guy. But what makes him unappealing? What makes us kind of not like him?
I think it makes him more authentic. I think that his the way that he is, the angle with which we see him and the way in which the story is told is a very, it makes him raw and human and authentic. One of the lines that I had to jot down really caught my attention. It's a little bit misogynist in a way, but toward the beginning of the book. The Herzogs moved to the Midwest, but after about a year of this new Chicago life, Madeline decided that she and Moses couldn't make it after all. She wanted a divorce. He had to give it. What could he do? And the divorce was painful. He was in love with Madeline. He couldn't bear to leave his little daughter, but Madeline refused to be married to him, and people's wishes have to be respected. Slavery is dead.
How is that misogynistic? I didn't see that as so misogynistic. Because he does have some misogynistic quotes. I was like, I was tensing up to...
the fact that at this point in time, the story was released in 1964. Mm-hmm. And this is about the transition for women's rights is taking place.
Right. Also, slavery as in the women being a slave to a man or something, and like being
the woman being
household...
the household servant.
Gotcha.
In a blown-up proportion is seen as slavery. And it seems like Herzog is being very blunt about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think he's more talking about holding her against her will, like not giving her the divorce would be treating her as a slave, whereas giving it to her would be not.
In a way, but he would be, in traditionally speaking, he would be in the position of power.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, the way he sets up the character of Madeline is that, granted, we're seeing it all from his perspective, but it seems like she really treated him pretty badly. She was the one that made him, first move out to the country, and then when she moved out to the country, she didn't like that. So then they left, and once they went back to Chicago, she was the one that made sure her lover would have a job, would have a house. In fact, they were fixing up the house for her lover, Valentine,
Her lover
to
was
move
his
in.
best friend.
Exactly. So, I mean, I could see him being like a little upset with her. I'm reminded in Hamlet, you can look at Hamlet as a misogynist because he says, what, frailty, thy name is woman, I think. But you have to understand, he believes that his mother married the man who killed his father and has only been dead just a few months. So to him, he thinks all women are bad. It's just like when you get when you have a bad breakup or something, you're not going to say that one person is bad. You're going to say all men or all women are bad. So that's, I think, the stage that he's at right now. But to his credit, Moses isn't like that. He really targets his anger where it should be directed, at Valentine and at Madeline. With the whole Ramona episode that runs throughout the book, you can see that he's definitely, obviously not, in misogynistic mode. He's almost running from woman to woman.
And then he was married once before to Daisy, and
Right.
he allegedly was the one that ended that marriage.
For Madeline, right?
Yeah, I think he was.
Well, he was with Sonos for a while too. That's like such a. I think the libido is such a strong theme running throughout this novel. I mean, it's so strong. Yeah, he's just like moving from one woman to the next. So, to me, to a certain extent, that's one of the things that weakens his character for me. Like he's so needy. He calls it potato love. Although I don't think that's a sexual love. That's his neediness that he wants to be liked by everybody.
This book it's very. Allegedly, this novel was very reflective of Bellow's life himself.
Right.
He was married 5 times.
But at this point, he had only been married twice.
Yes, this is the second wife.
Yeah, so there are lots of parallels. They're both in their late 40s. They're both professors. Yeah, so there are many many connections. But I mean, you saw, we were talking earlier, there is a triumvirate of writers, male writers in particular, white male writers in particular, post-war writers. You have Saul Bellow, you have Philip Roth, and you have John Updike. And he and Saul Bellow ended up getting the Nobel Prize for Literature when many critics were waiting for either Updike or Philip Roth to also receive the Nobel Prize. But I think of that triumvirate, Saul Bellow was the one that didn't get it first. And it's interesting, you were talking about covers before. This is from an early Penguin edition. And what I notice is that the name Saul Bellow is much larger than the title. So you're buying this book because of the name recognition of Saul Bellow. You're not buying it because of Herzog. You're buying it because he won a Nobel Prize.
The bestsellers in many cases. That's every James Patterson novel. It's James Patterson, title, and then his co-author. In little print.
Right. So it's just like an early form, I guess, of branding. But to get back to the point, I think he is a prickly, difficult character to like, and I'm with you, Larry. By the end, I could see it, but on the journey throughout, I was saying, can you, become a person on your own? Can you somehow exist on your own, or do you always need to lean on somebody? And it seemed like he couldn't. It seemed like he always needed to lean on someone.
Yeah, and the other qualities too. When you talk about the libido, it's just impulsiveness in general. Where he shows up at the house where they're going to let him stay there. I guess it's that woman's mother. I think. No, I don't remember exactly who it was.
You mean
in Connecticut when he goes away to Connecticut?
When he goes to, what is it, Martha's Vineyard?
Yeah, that goes away to Connecticut, a friend's house.
Yeah. In the very beginning, right? And then he just turns around the next morning and just leaves with a note and walks out.
Right.
It's strange behavior. It's impulsive and unpredictable.
But he is going through a breakdown, so that is part of it. And that kind of behavior is, connected to, when you're going through a breakdown.
One with Valentine's wife, Phoebe, was much more odd because her husband, Valentine, is having this active affair, and he's probably, if everything works out, going to step away. But he's just very meek about it. Really doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
No, it's-
And even at the end, she insists all the way at the end of the novel when Moses goes to see her. Moses, the lawgiver, the just, goes to see her. He wants her to admit that they're having an affair, and she won't. She just refuses to admit it. But she does give him, I think, the best advice, and she says what they did was really bad to you, and in a sense, you have to leave it. You have to let it go. And that does seem to be one of the movements that slowly, moves him away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a moment when he starts. Well, he'd all along been writing less and less letters, because of course the key to the novel is that he's writing letters to both manic letters to people both alive and dead, and that's like the psychosis coming out. Like he says, he's sitting there. And he's trying to hold it in, but he can't help it. He grabs a pad and he starts jotting furiously.
And I think it's interesting just because it gives you an idea of his mindset.
Yeah,
and we all think that we all have that train of thought. And I think that the train of thought is a very prevalent part of what makes this novel unique. Has anybody read Stoner by John Williams?
Yes. Oh, sure. I love that novel. Yeah.
It's I preferred Stoner to Herzog, but it's very similar in how Stoner is a very intuitive figure, very much into his studies, and he's surrounded by very
venal characters.
yeah,
right?
very psychologically and emotionally abusive people,
Yeah.
including his wife Grace. But toward the end of the novel, he begins to seek self-satisfaction.
But he's so much more of an appealing character. It's interesting.
I preferred it, especially when he stuck it to his boss.
Right. But I still think the question to me then becomes, why does Saul Bellow insist on making Moses so unattractive? Why does he keep talking about warts and all? These are warts on top of warts.
Because this is what he's good at doing.
Good, making you squirm a bit?
He's good at creating attractive, miserable characters. And in this, because Saul Bellow himself is a
Attractive and
Jewish
miserable.
American, most of his characters, to me, they remind me of Woody Allen movies.
That's a good point. Yeah, precursor to Woody Allen. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. A little heavier on the Spinoza and Hegel than Woody Allen. Yeah.
Mhm. What I get from him.
Yeah, I don't know much about the philosophers or the.
Right, because he's pretty thick on him. Yeah, I have some notes. I pulled out some quotes as well. This is just a line. He says he wrote to Spinoza, and then he goes into the letter that he wrote. And again, Spinoza, famous Jewish philosopher, early. I'm trying to think of the dates of Spinoza. I mean, you're talking medieval, I believe. He writes to Spinoza, "Thoughts not causally connected were said by you to cause pain. I find that is indeed the case. Random association, when the intellect is this passive, is a form of bondage, or rather, every form of bondage is possible then. It may interest you to know that in the 20th century, random association is believed to yield up the deepest secrets of the psyche." And I think that's a great quote to pick up on, because he's writing to an author from the past and kind of complaining about the world of today. He's definitely an American character, American Schmiel, I think, to borrow a Yiddish term. But he is living the intellectual and emotional life of a European.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, part of the tension in the book, that he's saying, no, there is a different way. And this is, in the 60s, he's coming up to the 50s, so he's kind of pushing against, much like other writers of the time period, though in a completely different way. In a way, you could say he's a little bit like Ginsberg, pushing against the tide, pushing against that corporate mentality, and saying, no, there is another way of life. There is another way of looking at life.
Yeah, and I think he's looking for the right way. And he writes Nietzsche too.
Oh yeah.
In the same way, complaining about kind of like the world that he left. With that's my big thing right now is Nietzsche. I mean, I haven't even read Nietzsche,
Yeah,
I want to.
But he's complaining about Nietzsche, though.
Yeah.
He's saying, Nietzsche, you have it wrong.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read one other line. He's talking now to a television promoter, a television personality who had like a panel discussion, and in that panel discussion was Jimmy Hoffa, who is probably forgotten now, but a figure. I know from my childhood growing up in the 70s, you constantly heard about him. He was a Teamsters Union official, very well known, suddenly disappeared. He gets killed, knocked off by the mob. So he's this like mystery figure. So he apparently was on this panel, and so he's writing a letter to the person in charge of the panel, the moderator. He says, if the aims of political philosophy be, as you say, to civilize power, to impress the brute, to improve his manners and harness energy to constructive acts, I would like to say that the sight of Jimmy Hoffa on your television show the other night made me realize how terrible a force angry single-minded this can be. I was sorry for the poor professors on your panel he was chewing up. I'll tell you what I would have said to Hoffa. What makes you think realism must be brutal? And I love that line because he's saying, people are, and that's what he's saying. He says reality instructors, he talks about. So these people constantly telling him, come on, wake up, Moses. You got to get to real life. People are going to be mean. You got to learn how to deal with them. You got to fight fire with fire. And his point is, why? You don't have to do this. If somebody tells you life is hard, you say, our duty as rational, sentient human beings is to make it better, to make it less hard. So you don't just accept the fact that the default position is bad, or as Nietzsche would say, hell. If you're going further back, that man is red in tooth and claw. It doesn't have to be that way. We can make a better life.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Train of thought.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think just going off of the Nietzsche stuff as well. He writes the letter to God, and it's about that time when things start to when he starts to calm down a little bit. And he says, I give up on pointing the finger at God, because that is kind of what people are left with without him, is you have to kind of blame somebody. You have to blame somebody. And a lot of people blame God. Mm-hmm. He also talks about how death has become a replacement for God, which is an interesting idea as well. For obviously we've read earlier this season, we read Necropolis, where that was quite literally kind of the case for the author of that book, where he kind of worshipped at the altar of death in order to survive the evils that surrounded him.
Necropolis, though, was a memoir that centered around somebody in the Holocaust. This is semi-autobiographical and just follows somebody who is dealing with really miserable circumstances.
Right. But his drawing, I think, he makes many mentions to the horrors of the 20th century, where you have not only the Holocaust, you have Stalinism, you have Maoism, responsible for the death of millions of people. And
Mao Zedong killed more people than anybody put together.
Yeah, so he that's kind of the backdrop of these personal demons that are reflecting him. And there are times we were talking before about what makes him kind of difficult to like.
But what I was talking about with the worship of death, and that he brings it up, and like you were saying in the same kind of backdrop of coming out of
the horrors of the 20th
first
century,
20th century, where things were horrible. We found out what we were capable of if we walked down the path of godlessness. And when he is kind of saying, I'm done blaming God, I'm done pointing the finger, because I don't think that that's going to work anymore. He writes that letter and he says, basically, just let me do your will. And then he's able to finally let go of his feelings of animosity. And what's going to happen next? That's kind of left up in the air, he's kind of just like floating on the stream for a while, it seems like.
Yeah, but he's going to hook up with Ramona pretty quick. No,
Yeah.
It's funny how the novel moves from so many different locations. Some critics have talked about Moses as the classic wandering Jew, because he's going through all these different places. He's rootless, but he lives in his mind, and that's really where his home is, in his mind and in ideas. So it's not so much a place. And that picks up, there's a British sociologist that talks about people as being somewheres or anywheres. A somewhere is rooted in a particular place, and they want that place, oftentimes more conservative because they don't want to change. And anywhere lives primarily in their mind, so they can just pick up and move anywhere and be fulfilled in some way, whereas the person that lives in a particular place finds fulfillment in that place. But it's interesting, too, that the novel, so much of the novel takes place in the city, yet it ends in a pastoral, right?
Mm-hmm.
It ends in an overgrown country house that is like decaying in some way, but he's trying slowly to put it into order. And after having so much words, there's just this a volcano of words coming out of him, he ends it.
That's where the story begins too, is in this rundown.
Yeah, exactly. So he ends it. At this time, he had no messages for anyone, no more letters, nothing, not a single word. So he's reached this point of calmness that he's able to maybe restart his life.
Sense of self-satisfaction.
Yeah.
How would we rate this on the 0 to 5 scale with half stars permitted, Larry?
Well, as I said before we started shooting, it's for me it took a long time to get going, like almost 2/3 of the way before things started to really get interesting. So, I'd say probably 3.5. I'd give it a 3.5, just because there's a lot to get through before, from a narrative standpoint, it starts to move. So yeah, and I don't know, it would help to have more of the background knowledge, like because he's writing about an intellectual who is well versed in romanticism, and his groundbreaking work is like romantic Christianity or romanticism in Christianity, and I don't know anything about romanticism really, so and then he's talking about all these different philosophers, like Heidel and
And Heidegger, he's very fluent in them. Like he talks about them like people today might talk about a TV show that they're familiar with, or a baseball team that they're familiar with.
Yeah. So with a greater background and all that, I'd probably be able to appreciate the first 2/3 of the novel better. But without it, it's just kind of wading through, trying to get to the point.
Yeah. I'm going to hold off on rating because I'm not sure how I would rate it, but I would think like a book like this, just what you were talking about, some of his novels were made into movies, and I would say, boy, it would be tough to make this one into a movie because so much of what is happening is going on in his mind. I'll leave it at that.
Already. Yeah, I've held off on rating once, and it was for Wuthering Heights, because I had no idea how I would properly give it the approach in that manner.
Right.
But I'm giving
here, yeah.
I'm giving Herzog a 4 because I think that it is it's a very fascinating piece. I think that there's so much to think about, and I think there's more that I can think about if I ever plan to revisit it.
Right.
But it is also very dense, and Moses Herzog is such a problem character per se. And there's things, while there's moments where you feel for him, you can't help but doing so, there's moments that you're like, huh? Especially when he plans to shoot and kill Valentine and Madeline so that he can get custody of the daughter.
Right.
It just was, that really did a dampering to his character in my mind. But there are other arguments that can be made that he's perfectly human, and he's perfectly a flawed human.
Perfect. How good is that? A perfectly flawed human. In other words, you're talking about everyone, right?
Pretty much. Yeah. Some people are more flawed than others. And Moses is certainly that in that case. already. If you're interested in checking out Saul Bellow's novels, I have the Library of America collection. I have the 4 complete editions. These are his first novels from 1944 to 1953. His second from 1956 to 1964. This is 1970 to 1982. And then his last from 1984 to 2000.
Well, that's quite a collection.
Mm-hmm. That's
That's
every.
complete works?
Yep.
That's his complete, his novels and his novellas. And then you have a more traditional book.
Which I held up earlier. Yep.
Mhm. Thank you for tuning in to our show. If you like what you see, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Be sure to join us next time for another episode of Literary Gladiators, and for now, keep reading.